All right, we are live. Hello to Facebook and YouTube. Okay, there you are, Leslie. Thank you. Always good to get some validation. And you too, Rosalie. So we're back in Assessment Immersion Training. And for those that don't know what this is, in Master Coach University, this is where plenty of coaches are mastering their craft. And we do these inside of immersion trainings where we go deep into one specific discipline of coaching. And this one we call assessment because we use these psychographic tools, a fancy way of saying graphing out what's going on inside of somebody's head so we can see it like in a graph. You can see the variations, the different aspects of what makes us tick. And we could take a look at those and really measure and compare and predict what kind of results, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and actually accelerate our coaching, our ability to make a difference for those clients using those tools. So we're back in officially week 5. This is a week 5 live stream, even though you may not be watching this in week 5, which is totally fine. But in week 5, we are going to cover something that I think is underutilized by most coaches that are new to psychographic profiling, and for that matter, what I would call assessment coaching. And the reason why it's underutilized, I think, is because of this right here, because it's complicated. And I just saw this the other day during the immersion training. Hey, Barbara. Hey, random Facebook user. So Facebook doesn't like to tell us who you are sometimes. But I saw this just the other day in the immersion training session. If you were there, you probably remember that we were looking at some group dynamics. We're just starting to get into group dynamics here and looking at the different strengths and weaknesses of a particular relationship. And everybody was just charging forward with, well, here's what I think this behavioral style, what that has in terms of an impact on this relationship. And here's how these people act. Here's their instinct and how their instincts operate in a relationship. And on and on and on about basically DISC. And DISC is a very, very important and prominent aspect of behavioral profiling, of any kind of psychographic profiling for that matter. But it's not the end-all be-all. And it just so happens that one of its strengths is its simplicity. And we can get a really good read on somebody very quickly in terms of just behaviorally, how do they operate, right? And so set that aside, we have this whole other area that we read, which we call values or motivators, basically what people's motives are, the why behind their actions, what gets them up in the morning, what they're interested in, what emotionally is driving them. You get the idea. And nobody's talking about how this impacts this relationship, right? And we're going on for 20, 30 minutes of this SWOT analysis and talking about how we're going to coach these individuals. And I'm like, wait a second, look at all of this information that we have about these individuals. Tell me what you would do. And one student, kind of virtually raised their hand and said, well, I think that means this. And it was great. But it was what about all the other stuff? I mean, there's probably days and days worth of what you could glean and extrapolate just from what we could see in what motivates these clients, because we had it on the page. And so I think this is the reason. The complexity of that a lot of times scares us off. It makes us not want to face it, where we can easily say, well, you're high D, so that means this. You're dominant and you go after your goals and you anger easily and you got a short fuse. Great. Okay, that tells us what the scene is going to look like, but it doesn't fully describe the depth of what's going on in an individual or a relationship or a group, however we're running the psychographics in that moment. So this is about moving your client to action, and what moves them to action, as it says here, what motivates your client. And the point here, I really want you to get in this little live stream here, that we are really doing these live streams outside of immersion training sessions to give deeper dives and more intricacy and conversational framework to what we only have so much time. We have limited time in the training sessions. We get complaints about that sometimes. And I want to make sure that we don't leave any stone unturned, and that you have a chance to really get the nuance around this and cover things that we just don't have time to cover in the immersion trainings themselves. So here's the point I was about to get to. When you understand what motivates your client, you understand your client. When you understand what motivates your client, you understand your client. And another way to say this is motivators override most of the other aspects of your client that can be measured or that are tend to be measured utilizing psychographic tools, behaviors, attributes, even personality. If you're running a Big Five or a Myers-Briggs, like motivators override all that stuff. It doesn't mean that stuff doesn't have its place. It doesn't mean that somebody's behavioral profile or their attributes and kind of their cognitive reasoning and function and personality approach doesn't have. I mean, these things have an influence. They have an impact on the way we live. They have an impact on the way your client's life is going to go and how they'll perform and on and on. But motivators really override that stuff. I'll give you an explanation. This is outside the notes here for a second, but I remember my mother ran a $1 billion real estate organization for much of her career. She's retired now, but she ran a regional real estate company. They did over $1 billion in business every single year. And she had like 18 managers under her. And then those 18 managers had like thousands of agents that, were buying and selling real estate, basically residential, mostly residential. And her boss, and this is a regional real estate company called Watson, and her boss was Bob Watson. He ran one of the most successful regional real estate organizations in the country for decades. And I mean, he's like 70-something years old now, still goes to work every day, driven individual, very successful. They have Watson Mortgage and Watson Plumbing and Watson Home Services and of course Watson Realty, which is buy and sell real estate, right? So billions of dollars of business done in this organization. And so Mr. Watson owns it, family runs it, and my mother worked for him directly. And she said, he started this organization, he started this company by going door to door selling real estate. He's trying to get customers, right? Just like door knocking. And we're talking about like probably 68 or something like that, right? It's way back, right? He was probably like 22 at the time. And she said, he went door to door and he got a couple customers and he make a little money. And then he went and found somebody else to work with him, like a real go-getter. And he trained this individuals and they went together door to door to get a little bit of business, right? And eventually he got another one. And then he started hiring multiple agents and he didn't have to go door to door anymore. He could just manage these people. Eventually he hired a manager and got multiple managers, multiple locations. And all the time he's making more money and he's buying commercial real estate and he owns a lot of my town basically at this point. And now he gets to sit back in his office and look at his ledger and just soak in the wealth, right? Just enjoy the fact that he owns, you can buy and sell most of us, right? And but she comes back to this story of how he got started, and she said, when he gets up in front of the company, when we have a big general sales meeting or the annual like awards gala where there's a couple thousand agents there, a bunch of managers, and we have these huge meetings. Thousands of people work for this guy, right? He gets up in front of the audience and he speaks, right? And he's a halfway decent speaker. He can talk in front of large groups. But she said, every time I see him get up in front of a crowd, I can see him sweating. I could see him like getting nervous and getting worried. And he knows how to do it, but I mean, it's not like he's not an experienced speaker, but it's tough for him. He's kind of got a knot in his stomach when he's doing it. And then he slowly gets up and he does his thing. But he doesn't really want to do it. He does it because it's part of his job. It's part of, hey, I run this company. I kind of need to show up and say something, right? And she said, when he was back, 45, 55, 65 years ago, just getting started and knocking on those doors, that was another thing he didn't want to do. Like, he doesn't want to speak in front of people. He's a total introvert, actually. His type is very low D, low I, high S, high C. Those of you who are in training, you know what I'm talking about. But, he is not, he's not an extrovert. He kind of likes to keep to himself. So going back to when he first started Watson, he's knocking on doors and meeting brand new people every couple minutes. This is not a comfortable thing for him. And so my mother tells me, she said, he was going against his type. Now, I call that behavioral profile or behavioral style. Same, right? She called it type. And they ran DISC on everybody in Watts, and they used it for hiring, as we help a lot of our customers do as well. So he did this day after day after day to get his business started. And I said to her, I said, Mom, why? Why did he do all that? Why does he get up in front of the groups? Why does he knock on these doors if he hates it? If he's not that kind of person? If that's not natural for him, how could he? Not just how could he once? I mean, it's hard enough for most introverts to do something like that once without throwing up. How could he again and again and again for decades? I mean, obviously he didn't knock on doors for decades, probably did that for a couple of years until he got to the point. I don't know how long it exactly took him, but he's still, for decades, he gets up in front of meetings, 10 people, 5 people, 50 people, 500 people, thousands of people, right? And still he's able to do this. And yes, the skill set is part of it, but that's just not him. And we know that, and we can measure it, and we can have empirical evidence of what's likely, what we can predict. How is this guy defying what is literally in our empirical assessments that are 93% face validity in university studies? And she said, because he was motivated to do it. He just wanted to make it. He just wanted to succeed. He wanted to make the money. He had to do it. He had to succeed. It wasn't a choice for him. He hated it, but he was willing to do anything. He was willing to do whatever it took. And so, and at the time when I had this conversation, like 15 years ago, I knew this technology, and I said, yeah, that must be it. His DISC alone, his behavioral profile, his knee-jerk instincts, they didn't explain his success. What explained his success was his motivations, his values. And so, as I just said, motivators override most of the other aspects of your client that can be measured with psychographic tools. They override behavior, they override instinct, they override even like the limitations of somebody's thinking to some extent. Obviously, there's certain things, you're not going to go, invent the light bulb if you're not smart enough to do so, right? They override personality. It was not his personality to go knock on those doors and speak in front of those groups. Motivators predict what your client will or won't do, what they'll pay attention to. In other words, what is even on their radar screen, and what they'll ignore. And of course, what they actually care about, because that's literally what motivators are. Motivators, what motivates you, that's what you care about, right? Your values is what you make a priority because you care about that stuff. So most of your clients are going to stay in a narrow band of decisions and situations and emotions and actions. They're going to stay in kind of a narrow corridor, if you will, or it's like I think the metaphor I wrote down was like if you're a cave splunker, I think they call it spelunking, where you travel through the caves and you crawl into these crawl spaces and you explore caves and map them out, right? If you ever gone on vacation to one of these places where you can go splunking, you get dirty and you go into the caves and you get claustrophobic, right? Well, good splunker, gets into that narrow corridor and he's just wedged in there and he lives through that, right? It's this little crawl space, but it's kind of narrow. It's constraining, if you will. And your clients will stay in a narrow cave, so to speak. This is kind of the metaphor. If you've stalactites and stalagmites here, you're going to stay in this narrow range of decisions. There's only so many decisions that you'll make and many that you won't in your life. And same for your client. You'll stay in a narrow range of situations. Right? You only go into certain places. You're not going to budge outside of the walls of the cave. Narrow range of emotions. There's certain emotions that you just won't go through. You won't feel. You won't allow yourself to get into. Have you ever coached anybody who, like, you can tell they have a wall up around anger, or a wall up around love, or a wall up around fear? Meaning, like, you start talking about that, or they start thinking about something that would cause that that emotion, all of a sudden they go numb on you. This is like, they just won't go any further, because literally their value set, the values that drive them, are keeping them in a narrow range of emotions. And then finally, actions. There's certain things that clients of yours just will or won't do. They'll stay in this narrow range of actions, literally just driven by their motivations, their what I would call their values, their priorities, what they care about. So this is our kind of picture of why people are motivated in a certain way. And we know that motivators are the priority emotional drives that a client has. Motivators, values are like, they're the emotional motor inside of your client that drives them wherever it drives them, right? And so whenever you ask your client, well, why did you do that? And you're just like, well, I just felt like it, or I couldn't help myself. It's like, that's their motivators. That's the motor of the mind that pushed them here or there. Were they consciously deciding that? Did they have an existential moment where they just willed it to be so? No, probably not. I mean, probably not. I don't want to say no flippantly, right? But most of the time, most of your clients are not just, like, creating themselves in their life out of nothing and just whimsically waving a magic wand and becoming whoever they feel like becoming, or whoever they don't feel like becoming, just deciding it is to be so. Very few people will ever do that. Maybe once or twice in their life, they'll do that. This narrow band is dictated by what they feel like. It's dictated by those motivators. And so that's the motor of the mind. That's what we are measuring when we are measuring values or motivators inside your values graph. You look at economic and altruistic and an aesthetic and theoretical, traditional, political, all those different values all are learning about. Like, those actually are what it's like a motor that's going, that drives somebody in a certain direction, in a particular way. Does that make sense? So that says a lot right there, I think. But the question is, today, whenever you're watching this, I'm gonna pose a different question than just what motivates your client, because you know that. Like, we don't even need to talk about that. You have the graph. You know, at least at work and in their career, what motivates them, and you can extrapolate a lot from that as you've already been trained. So we're not going to cover that today. But what actually motivates the motivators, though? What actually motivated that client to make economics really important, or altruism really important, or politics really important? Like, what actually motivated that? What predicated that? And I think this is one of the reasons why in class, or in the training session the other day, we had 90% of the commentary and the coaching that you guys gave were behavior. Because you don't really need a lot of explanation behind behavior. In fact, we already talked about it. It's kind of genetic. I mean, we don't really exactly know, but it's there very early on. And it's probably not very much nurture, right? But when it comes to values, it's like, why does somebody choose vanilla over chocolate, or strawberry over vanilla? Like, all of these things are supposed to taste pretty good. So what actually motivated the motivators in your client so it was the way it was? Because if you don't appreciate that, you're not even fathoming that, then you probably know how thin your appreciation and understanding of these values are. You're going to look at this economic value and say, meh, they just like money. No reason. They just do. And that's just the way they are. So anyway, and then you could talk about the processional effect of that and the domino effect of that, but you're not actually going to see very deeply into your client. just looking at that alone. And that worries me. And it probably would worry you, which would probably have you more hesitant or hesitating around giving commentary and coaching and analysis around somebody's values versus behavior. Now, I always loved values because I liked going deep like that, but that was me. Not every coach is more of a strategic style coach that goes deep inside of emotions and that kind of stuff. So why is that set of values your client's why? Why is, like, talking about like we're looking for values and your client has these whys, but why are those whys their whys? That's the question we're going to answer tonight. So I've created a little bit of a model here based upon our metaphor that we just talked about a second ago of kind of being wedged in this cave. Okay, I'm going to give you a full picture, so to speak, of why your client is in the crawl space they're in, and show you the kind of the predominance of this. Now, you'll learn more about this in strategy training, okay? But I wanted to give an excerpt of this because I think it's going to give you a level of depth of appreciation of this where you're going to really be pushing on actually bringing values and motivators a lot more often into the coaching conversations that you have. So let's see. I think we had a couple of answers actually to this. Why is that your client's why? Life experiences, accumulated beliefs. Okay, really, really great. Yeah, and those are great answers, by the way. The challenge I have with life experiences is, okay, great. So economic is really high for this client. Now I need to find out their biography to decide why that is the way it is. By the way, there are people with similar biographies, or maybe almost the same biographies, that have completely different values. So life experiences can explain the story behind, which is great. It's nice to know somebody's story because story drives people. We learn and teach and remember things through story, right? So it's a really great place to discover things, right? And also, it actually probably slowed down your process, which we're literally using assessments trying to accelerate. And by the way, what about when you're working with a group or an individual that you're never going to be seeing because you're working through the management, right? As we say you're supposed to be able to do, and you can't find their biography out then, or it might be very inefficient to do so. So it's a good start. Then Rosalie also says accumulated beliefs. That is a huge aspect, and we're going to look at this because beliefs are actually a part of this model. So we'll definitely get to that. Somebody has certain beliefs. It's going to predicate values for very specific reasons. We're going to talk about that in a second. So great answer with that one. I think you pretty much nailed it as far as the basic answer. And then finally, some beliefs were planted early in life and then became reinforced over time. Those congealed into values. Yes, you must have been through some training that we talked about that, or you just figured that out yourself, which is great. But that is usually the story, right? Somebody goes through life and they aggregate certain beliefs. They decide, water's wet, sky is blue, mom is a jerk, whatever, right? And these beliefs, some of them are beliefs that are of little consequences, and others have great emotional consequence. Like my belief about, fire is dangerous is a pretty important belief because it avoids me getting burned, which is quite painful, right? So then you have beliefs of great consequence, and then they congeal. In other words, they get reinforced, and we decide these beliefs are really important and they should guide my behavior and my decisions and what I pay attention to. Guess what? Now you got values. Because if you believe something's really important, that's just another way of saying a value, something that motivates you. It's like, this is important, it motivates me. That's it. If something motivates you, it is important. That's it, right? If it doesn't motivate you, flat out, it's not important to you. It just isn't. Because all that matter, like the whole idea of this brain and the way it's set up to navigate you through life, to make decisions, which are basically just value judgments. All decisions are values clarification. One thing is more important than another, and then working on a strategy to get what's most important and not necessarily what's least important, or to move away from other things that are important to avoid. That navigator, that navigator is nothing but values clarification. And so if like the purpose of those values is to move my body where it needs to go in life, to move my mouth, to have me say one thing or another, to move my strategies forward, which is another way of saying just body and communication. And I mean, this is it. That's all there is. So the brain is there to move the body around so that it does what it's supposed to do. And originally, obviously, that was like, throw the arrows at the prey and gather the berries and run away from the lions. Right now, it's much more complicated. You could do that too, but there's other games that we play that we, act like that's a lion now, where it really isn't a real lion. It's a virtual lion that we still get scared of, but you get the idea, right? So that's anything that is a value is a motivator. Anything that is a motivator is a value. They are basically the same thing. And the reason we call them motivators is because they move us physically, tangibly, etc. And values are just like what's behind that. And so beliefs that move you to action, beliefs that actually have enough consequence such that we have to make a decision based on that, those are values. Those are values. Now, the hierarchy of those values, then that brings more complexity into it. Sure. Okay. But the bottom line is, yes, you're absolutely right, Rosalie. Beliefs were planted early. Something happened. You decided you had beliefs about pleasure and pain. They had consequences to them. They congealed into values through finally starting to make decisions based upon those beliefs. And there's the story. But I want to give you an even more kind of comprehensive view of why somebody's motivations, why somebody's values, that when you look at their graph, are the way they are. So let's get to it. So let me explain this little model here that we've created. First thing is that the space in this cave, as we've been talking about it, that's like where you can move in the cave is bordered by these, as I've drawn them, kind of stalactites and stalagmites. Think of the stalactites and the stalagmites not as values, but as needs. People talk about all sorts of different hierarchies of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I talk about survival needs, especially in strategy training. But the bottom line is we have certain survival, not just instincts, but needs that are emotionally hardwired into us. And so if we get too low in the cave, we're going to start hitting one of these sharp rocks, so to speak. And what that sharp rock is it's like a motivator to move back into the space that we've defined for ourselves. And that would mean, like, things get too low, we start losing needs. Need like certainty, or somebody might call comfort, like their comfort zone. A need like significance or love. These are needs that everybody universally must meet. And if you're not meeting them at all, you hit one of these sharp rocks, you move back into the space. Okay. That is like the border for you. Now, different people have different tangible borders, but everybody's got the same borders in terms of their needs, meaning as soon as their love goes to zero, they got to move. As soon as their significance goes to zero, they got to move. So they're going to come off the floor of this cave, of this crawl space here, and move back into the center space. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so that's the needs being lost. Now, different people lose different needs at different times based upon beliefs, but we'll get to that. So we define where our needs are lost. But then we've also got the ceiling here, which is basically, it's the same needs, but it's where they're fully satisfied. So if I'm fully satisfying my need for love, or my need for significance, or my need for variety, well then, I mean, it's not painful that happens. I actually feel really satiated, right? But it's kind of like being full after a big meal. It's like you don't really want any more, right? So all of a sudden things cool off. Now, some people will keep going, but again, that means they're really not satisfied. You ever meet anybody who's never satisfied? I mean, there's probably areas in your life where you're just never satisfied, right? That means you can never meet your needs at the highest level from that particular vehicle. And so you'll just keep going. And so your space is very, people like are driven to the next level over and over and over again, whether it's in relationships or finances or business or coaching or whatever. It's because they've set up, their beliefs are that there's no ceiling and they just keep going up, right? But most people have a bit of a ceiling in most areas of their life, and so they hit one of these stalactites and they come back down into the space. That is not a painful experience, it's a pleasurable experience, but it's enough pleasure to get you lazy. It's enough pleasure to get you to kind of cool off a bit and not try so hard. One of the best ways to explain this, one of the best examples would be in a relationship. Have you ever been like in love with somebody, like just head over heels, and you're with them and you're like, oh my God, I'm so lucky to have this person, and you'll do anything for them, and you just like every day you're just showering them with love or whatever you know that they need, and just anticipating their needs and giving them more than they could ever ask for. And then that relationship continues for like more than a couple days. And then like a couple weeks later, a couple months later, for some people who are really amazing, a couple years, a couple decades later, suddenly kind of take that for granted, and then you cool off. And it's not like you don't love them anymore. It's not like you don't need them, but you're not like on fire anymore. You're not like hungry to give to them and contribute to them at the level that you originally were. You still love them, right? But you're not nuts anymore. You've lost that craziness, right? As we would describe it usually in Western society. It's kind of crazy, head over heels, right? That was you hitting one of these stalactites. You were fully satisfied. And you said, you know what? I got everything I need here. I met my love need at a 10 out of 10. I can take it easy. Now, some people take it so easy that they lose that relationship, and suddenly they feel the loss of that, and then they go crazy again, right? And they bounce around inside of this space. But the bottom line is it's a fairly universal experience that most of us have experienced, where we're like, why was I so excited about this person yesterday, and today I'm like, well, that's nice. Well, that's because you fully satisfied your needs. You're full. You're a full meal. You just don't need any more. Doesn't mean it doesn't taste good. You just don't need any more. So this is where everybody lives. Nobody lives below these because they kill themselves or go crazy and find their way back into here. And then nobody lives above these because, again, they don't need to. Once you meet your need at a 10 out of 10, there is no motivation, right? So you stay in this space. This is like the space of your human experience or your client's human experience. Make sense so far? All right. So that's the crawl space that we've got here. That's kind of the cave that your client resides in. But here's the thing. Your client is normally, I won't even say that. Normally, your client, let's put it this way. Your client doesn't expect you as their coach to push them past their satiation point. And your client also definitely doesn't expect you to coach them to lower their standards to the point where they're not even meeting a survival need. Like, nobody's expecting that. Now, this could be a really good thing, and it may be needed, but it's very, very challenging, and it's something we cover in strategy trainings, and we're not going to cover it today. But the point of the matter is, this could be nice to like push them past when they're kind of feel like it's enough and it's good enough, make them hungry for more, right? And work with them on motivation in that way. That's great. I don't see any reason why we would ever do that, generally speaking, unless your client has such ridiculous standards for meeting their needs. They're like, well, I have to have this luxury yacht. It's $1 billion or else I won't feel good about myself. It's like, okay, maybe we need to like alter, maybe that is your standard. Maybe that's a goal and you can have that as a goal, as a standard, but maybe not as a rule for whether or not you can feel good about yourself, right? Maybe that's a problem. And then we maybe need to lower that. So there are actually times where that it's probably a good idea, actually. But your client isn't pushing for this kind of stuff. Really what your client wants usually is to help them motivate themselves within the realm of what they feel is reasonable, what they expect that they can do or might do, but they just haven't done. That's really what they're looking for in terms of motivational coaching. And then besides that, they're also just looking to work out the rest of the issues in their life that are within the realm of reason. Again, so the point of the matter is, these are the borders. Now let's get into actually where the coaching will usually happen and what you want to understand about your client and their motivations. So your client, think of your client as like a heat-seeking missile, but they have two targets. They have the pleasure target, which is where the missile wants to go. It's like, I want to get more of that pleasure. But they also, unlike most heat-seeking missiles, they also have a pain target here. And the pain target is not about what you want to hit. You want to get away from that target. right? So you've got these two competing targets. Sometimes they do conflict, like we talked about last week. And these targets guide all of their behavior. Pain and pleasure, pain and pleasure, pain and pleasure. From day one, this is what they had. This is the programming that they had in them, okay? Now, people define pain and pleasure differently, okay? Why and how? What's behind that? Beliefs. Think of your clients' beliefs, like the way they look at life, the way they look at themselves, like what they think is true and not true, right? There are global beliefs about people and about life and about the government, about money, about business, ethics, things like that. And then there's also very personal beliefs about like, who am I? What do I deserve? What am I capable of? Am I a good or bad person, right? So we have these big, huge kind of macro beliefs. And then we have these very specific like identity beliefs. And then we have all these other contextual beliefs about very specific aspects of life, like physical life, time in life, money in life, and on and on. I mean, you could just go on and on forever, right? There's infinite beliefs that we have about infinite things, basically, for lack of a better way to constrain it. So think of beliefs in this motivational context, because beliefs on their own don't motivate. Think of beliefs like a projector, because these targets are moving targets and they're not the same for any human being, right? So what happens is your client has these beliefs, and think of these beliefs as like maneuvering and repositioning where the pleasure target is, and maneuvering and repositioning where the pain target is. They move these targets, right? They're not like set in stone. And so many coaches, is unfortunate. They think, well, everybody wants this and everybody wants to get rid of that. That's not true at all, right? And if you treat your client like that, if you coach your client like that, or try to diagnose what's going on with your client like that, you are going to miss out on pretty much everything there is that you could have given that client. Maybe you give them a few platitudes, but I mean, that's not very useful. It's not very valuable. I mean, you could get that out of your personal growth book. That is not a great representation for what's possible and the greatest expression of what the value of coaching is. Not at all. So these are moving targets, and they are moved by beliefs. That's why I drew this line here. Think of these beliefs are like a projector, and they project onto the wall of the cave, right? Where pleasure is and where pain is. And then it moves it based upon the shift in beliefs. And this is not because this is true. This is just because that's the belief that you projected, or that your client has projected. Okay. So beliefs delegate out the pain and pleasure. You don't just feel pain and pleasure. I mean, at least emotionally speaking, for no reason. You feel them because your beliefs have already already preempted where that pain and pleasure is. Even if it surprised you, it's like, yeah, that belief set you up for that, or your client for that. Okay. So these beliefs, this is why pain and pleasure targets are where they are. And then here's the other thing that happens, really interesting. The pleasure intensity that you might experience, your client might experience, and the pain intensity level, when you actually, because you don't always hit these targets. Sometimes you're like, you have some near misses, you got close, got kind of excited on that, but then you hit a target, right? And that target, I don't know if it's on the bullseye or not, that's going to hit a certain intensity level. And these pleasure and pain intensity levels, they point back to beliefs. And you revise your beliefs. Your client revises their beliefs based upon what they experienced, the intensity of pain and pleasure they experience, and wherever they experience that. I saw this just the other day. There's a video where this guy goes and he interviews basically the homeless in all different situations, and most of them have addiction issues. And I remember just a couple days ago, he interviewed this woman, and he said, have you ever thought, you're really smart, you're young, you got your whole life ahead of you. You ever thought about like getting off the street? You ever thought of getting off the street and like clean up your life? And she said, I've been to rehab 18 times. But she said, I've never wanted to go. And it really doesn't work unless you want it to. And I never wanted it to work. I just did it to get off the street. I just did it because somebody made me. And he said, well, why don't you want it? Why don't you want to get back to your life? And she said, I actually like this life, right? Pleasure, right? I like that life, living on the street homeless. Most of us would be like, that's the worst thing that ever happened to us. She likes it, right? And she said, and he said, well, but isn't the other life like having a family and a house and a job? And so like, what's wrong with that? And she said, I don't want the responsibility, right? So she said, responsibility is over here in pain. And, probably a pretty high intensity of pain for her. And then she talked about her friends on the street. She talked about, it's always exciting. It's a hustle bustle. She had all this connection and love from people on the streets, and it was exciting. It was an exciting life, and you didn't have to worry about anything. You didn't have any pain, right? Not to mention the drugs that I'm sure she did were very pleasurable, and she enjoyed those, right? Some of the harder drugs that one can take. So she probably, at one point in her life, sampled that life and sampled the drug and sampled her beliefs allowed her to do that based upon the already existing targets. And then her pleasure intensity went way up for certain drugs or certain experiences on the street. Her pain intensity went way up for certain things that were the opposite of that. You can think of like a pinball bouncing off the side of the pinball machine. It's like, oh, responsibility, that's not good. Rehab, that's not good. This is all pain. And then all the pleasure from all these other things, those informed on the beliefs move the targets now. And now her target is live on the street until I die, kill myself through drugs. And that's predictable. That will never change. Is that hardwired into this person? Probably not. But is it likely that that's going to change unless there's a massive rerouting of these beliefs, these targets, and the intensity levels of pain and pleasure that would actually have this person live a different life? Absolutely, that's required. That's the why behind her why. And if you're really going to operate with what's going on in somebody's values, you got to be able to get to that. So you've got beliefs. They inform on where these targets are. You've got intensity of pleasure and pain, and it creates a revision through the belief kind of filter, through the belief projector, if you will. And all of this comes together to become the values that you see in the tools that we've been working with. The reason why that person wants, money, they're high economic. Perhaps they enjoy, the power and respect. That's a pleasure for them, but it also meets a need at a high level that comes with the money. Or perhaps maybe they don't even care about that, but they love their father, and their father is all about money, and they want to connect with them. So it's pleasure to be like dad. And they got intense pleasure because dad loves it when they talk about money, or loves it when they focus on money. And so the belief projects that, and now money is pleasure for them. Or maybe it's certainty. Maybe for them, somehow their belief is, okay, if I lose enough money, I won't have control over warm, full, and dry, and then I'll be out on the street, like we just talked about. And then I'll lose my needs. And so pleasure for me is money, but it's mainly because I'm trying to get away from the bottom of this barrel of losing certainty or losing significance, because that's significance to me. That's what you want to look for. You want to look for the depth of what's behind those graphs that we're reading here. Staying where they are is a prevailing attitude. This is not static, but it will look to us as coaches like it has been static. And although, values do change, right? These pain and pleasure targets, they change. The hierarchy changes, and we'll get to that final piece in a second. But it just generally doesn't change that fast, because beliefs tend to bend a little bit, but they don't really break very often. They're fairly, at most points in people's lives, things are fairly static, and their beliefs reflect that. Somebody has a major life event, beliefs might change this stuff very, very quickly. So where you see that graph showing up is when it's like, think about the entire aggregate or the entire kind of multiplying of needs that are pushing people towards certain things or away from other things, needs that are satiated or not, right? Beliefs about life and themselves and money and giving and ethics and God and all this stuff that then project pain and pleasure targets all over the walls of these caves. And then intensity comes back and revises it. And that whole, I mean, that's a story to some extent, but at the same time, it's a mechanic. And then so the kind of the envelope within the envelope that all of this gets packed into are the values. All of this stuff becomes, this is most important, this is second, this is third, this is fourth. That's it. And so although the pleasure and pain targets don't really have a hierarchy to them, like it's not like a perfect order, it's not a linear list number 1, list number 2, list number 3, we can create a list that is the, like, again, like the priorities that you're looking at in that graph don't reflect what's going on in the brain, right? What's going on in the brain is you've got these targets everywhere, all over the wall of that cave. It's very confusing looking probably in there. It's a mess. And some of these are conflicting, and some of them point people in a certain direction, and they've synthesized or some things have precipitated out of this, and some things are still confusing for them. They have varying intensities depending on context, and they have beliefs that are projecting all this stuff. But like, if you really do the math on all that, or you look at their behavior and they have to answer a question like on a assessment, let's say, they're gonna have to pick like all this stuff is firing off in their brain, and they just say, that's number 1, that's number 2, that's number 3, that's number 4. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the reflection of all this craziness in kind of like the way they'll decide and behave and focus, because all the stuff that came before it, all the stuff that was required for them to even answer those questions, if they did it with any kind of focus and clarity. Not everybody does. That's really what you're seeing in those graphs. This is what's behind it. So I just had a little bit of a blow up with a client of mine. They got really upset at something really, really tiny. I'm not going to get into what it is. It's like we had to move a session, and they said, yeah, I'll move the session. And then like they called me back and like, I don't really want to move the session. And I was like, well, it's too late. And then they got upset and they pointed fingers, and it was not pretty. Okay. It wasn't fun for anybody. Okay. But, I found out later, as people cooled off, that it turned out that they were tired. Okay. So the story was, I was just tired. Well, I'm looking deeper than that for a client that I work with. So it's like I listened to her say, I'm tired, or I was tired, I didn't have any sleep. And I thought, people get tired, but they don't blow up like that. And also, why is this person, and this particular client, she is constantly tired. She gets horrible headaches, gets nauseated from these headaches, mainly when she's losing sleep. She just doesn't get decent sleep very often. I mean, sometimes she does, but a lot of times she doesn't. She really like wrings her hands about stuff, gets super stressed out. So I wanted to know not just the cause of what was really going on behind the blow up, but I also wanted to know what's going on behind this person, like really hurting themselves in terms of their longevity and their energy level and their effectiveness from not being able to sleep very, very well. So I know this client fairly well. And so as I talked to her about this later on, we talked about how she overworks herself to death, and she stresses over every little expense. Like she just got an expense from school, and it's multiple thousands of dollars. And so she's really fretting about that, right? And she works and works and works really, really hard, long hours. She could barely make ends meet in terms of time, right? She's basically working at like 98% capacity. And if you've ever done that, where your schedule is fully booked, like every day, 6 days a week, not just like a busy day, but like there is no time for me. There is no time for well-being. There is no time for anything but go, 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 earn, go to sleep, and do it again, right? Like things, like some people can deliver that, but not very many. Or a lot of people, like something's got to give, and is not a great life. And so this is like her life, right? And I asked her, because I could tell there was some rule that was broken that had her like stressing out majorly, that then had her stress out on me, right? And so I asked her that. I was like, hey, what's your rule that was broken that has you like so flying off the handle here? And she said, I'm worried about this bill. And I pressed further. I said, like, oh, but yeah, but why? Like, well, why is that such a big deal? It's just one expense. Like, you can afford that. And she could. And she said, you know what? I know what it is. I've been worried about getting old and not having enough money to survive. And I said, why? You've got support from your ex, and you live in a pretty good socioeconomic spectrum. You are a good earner. You've got a doctorate degree. I mean, you're gonna be fine. You're gonna make it. I mean, but maybe that's not like your standard. And she said, yeah, I mean, I really want to have a great life all the way through to the day I die. I'm like, okay, I understand. So you've decided your standard is you have to have an amazing lifestyle. And that in the next 10 to 20 years, if you're not going to work as much or you're going to retire eventually, it's not going to be as easy to predict that you'll be able to maintain that same lifestyle. So you're going to get a sense of loss of meeting your needs that you're currently meeting at a certain level. And she said, yeah, that's what it is. That's exactly what it is. I'm really, really scared about that. And I said, well, if you get support from your ex-husband and all these things are working out and you've got the house and like, what's the problem? She said, I don't even want to rely on that though. I want freedom too. And freedom was a very important value for her. That's pleasure for her. So it's like, I realized that for her, it's like, I've got economic stress and I can handle it, but only through giving up freedom. And I have to have freedom too. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. She was in a double bind at that point. And every expense would just push her off the deep end and she wouldn't be able to get sleep. And then all of a sudden she's wondering why she's going off the handle about like making a very small change. All this came from just that little blow up. I mean, it was a big blow up, but it was like figuring out what was going on there. And so I told her, I said, you know what? You don't have a clear plan or a clear vision for how your money needs to look in order to survive, in order to really thrive. You're not really clear on that. Because I asked her, I said, long term, it's not going to be labor that makes you the money. It's going to be investments and having your finances in order, having a good plan that'll give you a good yield on your, return on invested capital. I mean, this kind of stuff. I knew she understood this, so we could talk shop on it. And I was like, well, how many hours a month do you spend doing that? She's like, well, maybe a couple a month. I said, clearly that's not enough for you to have what you need. I asked her, do you have a clear plan for what it's going to take for you to get where you want to be in this retirement zone of your life that you're so worried about and freaking out about? She said, no, I don't really know. I was like, well, you could make one. And the fact is that you don't have it. You don't have that vision. You don't see the strategic plan for how that needs to look and how you're going to get there. So you really have no clarity about what your beliefs are about what you need to value, what your rules need to be in order to get you where you need to go. And so instead, you've got these ridiculous rules about how much you have to work and how much money you have to have. And like, you really don't need it to be that way, but you've set that up because you're compensating for the lack of focus in another area where you've got a really, not a weak muscle, but you've underworked yourself. And I said, do you have clear standards for your body? And I knew she did. I knew she was going to answer yes. She said, yeah. I said, when's the last time you've been to the gym? She's like, I was there this morning. And I said, okay, so you spend a couple hours a month on like your entire future for your finances and freedom and retirement and how you're going to like how your life is going to go, which is huge for you because I knew she was very high economic. And yet every day you're like focusing on your body and taking care of yourself. You're not worried and stressed about your body. You're worried about and stressed about economics. And I wonder why. You're undervaluing that area, behaviorally speaking, even though it's so important to you, supposedly. So I said, look, if you don't get clear and spend time on your money side of your life, you're going to continue to hurt. And it's not about some expense. It's not about this school thing. It's not about these ups and downs. It's certainly not about your schedule. And it has very little to do with time other than that you're over consuming your time because you're worried so much about the money and you wonder why you can't pivot to the new career, that's literally what I've been coaching her about lately. She's stuck in a career she's not happy about and she wants to go to this other career. It's like, no wonder you're stuck. You have no freedom because you're a slave to this financial burden that you've given yourself because you haven't clarified what it's going to take to win the game that's not just based upon your labor only. Now, can you imagine the coach that would have unraveled all of that had, number one, I not understood her values and known what her values are, but number two, understood what was behind it? Because I knew for this particular client that, sorry, I'm going to get my notes on in this one. I knew that for this particular client, I think I got this out of order. I apologize. Actually, I don't even think I wrote this down, so we'll spitball it. I knew for this particular, I know this client very well, so this shouldn't be a hard one for me. I knew for her, certainty was very important for her. She needed stability, but she also wanted freedom. She valued freedom as a pleasure target. So those seem like they're conflicts, and they are for her. Because money equals freedom, but money also equals certainty, and she plays money for certainty more than for freedom, although she still wants that. So she's trying to balance those two, and she's not balanced at all. But she feels like she's so close to losing the need for certainty, mainly because she hasn't measured it accurately, and she has lack of clarity. So she's blurry on that. So she keeps hitting this bottom stalactite, and it keeps pushing her to do these things, but that hits pain because then she loses freedom, which is very high intensity pain. So she guaranteed she has a life of pain and suffering and lowering her health consequences because she never gets any sleep. It makes her nauseated to do that, right? And her ultimate aspiration, if not value, is to be totally free and have more money than she needs so that she doesn't have to rely on spousal support. She's significant enough and powerful enough to have done that for herself, and she's super strong. Solve significance, right? But you can see the whole game is money related, if not achievement related, as a high D that she also is. So it's like, it's no wonder that with these rules and high intensity pain from things that are not happening well with her family right now and not happening with money the way they need to, and high intensity loss of pleasure because she doesn't have enough freedom that she's had at times and felt really good about. It's like those beliefs are constructing a way that she's going to be constantly suffering, constantly freaking out, and constantly motivated to do things that are actually hurtful to herself and others. So what I didn't put in my notes, but that is her particular little crawl space that she lived in, and she's wondering why she's not free. She's wondering why she's so upset. She's wondering why she flies off the handle. We know why, and we know what the cure is for that, or we have many different cures, because she could just change what she's decided that her standard is for finances, or she could actually meet the standards that she has and figure it out and be very precise about it, which you kind of need to in financial world. And she knows that because she understands that area and it's valuable to her, right? So she's not, the game that she's playing in life, she's not playing it full out, as though no wonder she loses it all the time. So any questions about this, let me know, because that is the big takeaway from today, is to really get clear on what's behind what I see in the values and what you see in your client's values, and what you should also be looking for so you understand what the connection is between somebody's life, their story, their relationships, their emotions, and then their values that you see. Because that value, like the values that you see, and we just talked about this, it's like the very surface like iteration that you can look at with your eye, you can see, and this is all the stuff that's below the surface of what's actually going on the surface of that report that is so easy to read, right? And you want to be able to understand what's behind that. These values should open up a whole can of worms in terms of questions that you ask your client, explorations that you do with your client, and then understandings with how these values may have come about, or why they are where they are, and the multiplicity of possibilities of why they might be where they are, so you don't get pigeonholed into constructing this value means only this. No, it doesn't. It could mean all sorts of things. Does it manifest in particular behaviors and choices and valuations and decisions? Sure. But what's behind that could change the whole game. And you want to understand that too. So we'll talk about questions you can ask and conversational frameworks for that in just a second. I also want to get to something that a few of you have been commenting about, that, you know, we've been talking so much about behavioral profiles and values profiles and doing so much work there. We haven't really worked that much on a whole other assessment that you actually have access to with your clients, which is what we call the attributes index. Those that aren't familiar with attributes, it's basically a way of measuring your cognitive capacities with soft skills, situational awareness, situational intelligence, and contextual skills, so to speak. Soft skills for short, the kind of things you can't measure in like an SAT test, right? So way beyond English and math, like, resiliency and integrative ability and creativity and empathy, like stuff like, they don't teach you this stuff in school. You either got it or you don't, cognitively speaking. So cognitively speaking, we measure different clarity levels, but we also measure bias. And when it comes to values and what moves people to action, those biases make a difference. So within your cognitive like dimensions of thought, thinking in these different dimensions, you will see things differently and make different decisions because there's biases inside those attributes. You have biases for and against those different attributes that you have. So attributes and the bias around that, those dynamics that you can read in the assessment results that you've got within that particular PDF, it answers the question, how should I think about what I'm thinking about? How should I think about what I'm thinking about? So you can take whatever, like the monitor behind me, and say, I'm going to think about that emotionally, like it's beautiful. Or I'm going to think about it practically, like, hey, it's useful. Or I'm going to think about it like intellectually and more kind of theoretically, like it's a monitor and that's what it is. It just is what it is, in very black and white, logical, kind of emotionless terms. And how I think about that, or how I think about love, or how I think about people, or how I think about this will change depending on which thought process I use, right? Which kind of scanner or processor, if you will, that I use, because I have all three processors. We all have emotional intelligence, right? We all have practical intelligence, and we also all have theoretical or binary intelligence, the ultra simple, like do this, do that kind of intelligence. We all have them at different levels, but we also have biases about which area we use or overuse or underuse. And those biases inform on how we filter everything. So when you think about whatever you're thinking about right now, are you feeling it, like having emotions about it, or noticing emotional reactions of yourself or other people? Are you logicking your way through it? Like 1 + 1 always equals 2, very kind of, very, Elon Musk hyper logical about it, kind of cold and calculating? Or are you making value judgments and measuring it? Like, this is better or worse, so I'm going to compare it to that, and kind of you're doing your calculations around it in terms of the practicalities of it. It reminded me, I don't know why I thought of this when I was preparing for this today, but there is this song that I learned in music, as a jazz performer. We learned this because it was a kind of a classic show tune that had been redone by one of the great improvisers that we would study. But I just found out today, because I did some research preparing for this, that the first time this tune was evidently written and created and prepared like for the screen, it was in the 50s for a movie. I can't remember the name of the movie, but it was a movie about a great author that wrote like like Little Mermaid and all these kind of classic kids novels, right? I think it's Hans Christian Andersen, somebody like that. Anyway, doesn't matter. Anyway, so it's basically like a pseudo musical 1950s movie, and so this guy it's a story about this guy who's super creative, and then the kids around him are all made to be logical kind of automatons that only do math, right? And so there's this scene in the movie where all the kids are reciting their times tables, and like one of the kids is outside. I guess he was kicked out of class or something, and they're looking at the first like caterpillar of the season, and he's like, "Look, an inchworm," and Hans Christian Andersen is looking at this inchworm, and he starts singing the song. It's called Inchworm, right? And he says, inchworm, measuring the marigolds. you and your arithmetic will surely go far. So, right, like logic, right? And then he repeats it, right? Inchworm. Seems to me you'd stop and see how beautiful they are, right? So are you measuring the size of the flower, or are you just appreciating and feeling its beauty, right? He, whether he knew it or not, and the author, whether they knew it or not, and the songwriter, whether they knew it or not, were actually writing about our Hartman value profile. They were actually writing about our attributes index, dimensions of thought. Isn't that crazy? And I'm playing this tune, 20 years ago in jazz studies, right? Great tune also, but I just didn't know the history of it. So you can measure how large the flower is, or you can bask in its beauty. You can't do both at the same time. I mean, you could, right? But it's unlikely, right? You're probably going to overvalue one of those thought processes. And all of us do this, whether we're actually analyzing our own crawl space or looking with our clients and dealing with them. So I just saw this today as well. These attributes that we decide on, that we have a discriminatory approach to, over and under evaluating, over under using different ways of seeing things. Now, like recently, it just came out, there's UFOs are real, and they have this footage of it, and the Pentagon has released it and everything. And so I'm watching this today on the news, and they're going over the different kind of cartography or photography of these UFOs, right? And they show an infrared image of the UFO. And then all of a sudden it changes to a black and white TV image of the UFO. And then it changes to the radar image of the UFO. And this guy who's like, he's an airman, he's clearly in the Air Force, says, that is a different kind of imaging than that is, which is a different kind of imaging than that is. This shows heat signatures. This shows like the actual photography, like the light. And then this over here just shows like a radar beam that's being bounced off of something. And the radar didn't even work for the UFOs, evidently. So that's you looking at your life, or looking at your love life, or looking at your apartment, or your job, or money, or this for that matter. You see this maybe in a black and white picture, or you see it in infrared. This is can you imagine somebody with different pain and pleasure targets and different need structures, but also sees the world in more systematic terms like a computer does? Can you imagine how that would shift how intense their pain is and pleasure is, and how their beliefs move these targets around? Can you imagine how, if someone's overvaluing or biases towards more emotional intelligence and thinking from how something feels, the intrinsic aspect of life within themselves and or outside of themselves, and how that would intensify different emotions for them, how that would project different things on the wall of this cave, how that would alter what the size of their crawl space is, and what they're actually, it's almost like why they're positioning these things, because they literally filter it differently. There were certain types of imaging where you couldn't even see the UFO, and there were other types where you could see exactly what's going on. You could tell that these UFOs, for instance, did not have propulsion. Like they didn't have like a rocket engine. They didn't have any kind of like fossil fuel kind of thing. Didn't have anything like that. Maybe they were electric, I don't know, but there was no exhaust, right? They could tell that not with a black and white screen. They can only see that through the infrared imaging. Different imaging, different picture, different evaluation, different values. Different values, as we talked about today, different life. So there are also values that come into or reflect on how somebody cognitively will measure life itself, measure what's coming into life for that matter. And that's how that answers the question, how should I think about what I'm thinking about? That actually answers that. You see the same thing. You and someone else, you and your client, so to speak, could see the same thing, but how you see it and what aspects of what you see are going to be different. How you see it will be different, and the aspects. Again, you couldn't see the lack of exhaust unless you had the infrared. It's the same for a lot of your clients. They won't even be able to see this stuff. They'll be blind to it sometimes compared to how you see it, because you might have different biases towards how you measure this stuff, because you'll process it with a different computer, with a different part of your brain. So your client has preferences, or they have a preference to how they like to see things. Do they like to see the story of things, the poetry, the emotion of things? Because that's the intrinsic dimension. You could see that in the graphs. Do they like to see the usefulness or comparison or quality of things? That's going to be practical thinking, extrinsic motivations. Or do they like to see the logic or definition of things, the systemic aspect? Think of those not just like filters or ways to think about things. Think of those as motivations. I can have a systemic motivation to stop right this minute, but I can have an intrinsic motivation to continue the live stream, right? And you might as well, right? Intrinsically, it's like, hey, I feel like continuing, but systemically, I need to stop, right? Because of the time, right? So you have a digital watch brain, and then you have the feeling brain, and then you've got the practical brain that says, how much money is this making me? And you know, they're all processing. You have all of them available to you, but you will overvalue one of them more than any of the others, and your client will as well. And that's what your attributes index says, just by looking at those little gauges, those little the little needles at the bottom and the arrows that are right close to the top of your bars. Your client has a preference to how they like to see themselves as well. And that could be different because they have a different section of the graphs. The story or poetry or emotion within themselves. The usefulness or comparison or qualities within themselves, or the logic and definition of themselves. That may change dramatically. And each of those areas, thinking about themselves, thinking about the world, they might have different value sets or different pleasure and pain kind of amplifiers that are amplified by different beliefs and needs that govern different aspects of the very values that you see on your graphs. How's that for complicated? So this is why I think most coaches avoid this area, because they don't want to go deep like this. They don't want to see this stuff. And what I'm telling you is this ain't too complicated for you to understand. If you understood half of what I told you tonight, you can watch this 10 times and understand the rest. Okay. You know, we're not talking about, you know, rocket science, and we're not talking about brain surgery here. There are only 10 or 20 moving parts. That's not that many. Okay. I mean, the average car mechanic knows way more than 10 or 20 moving parts. Now, I'm not saying the human animal is more simple than a car. It's just that you just don't have to understand that many mechanics in order to understand what makes your client tick. You can actually see through it quite clearly with a couple different aspects, and then seeing the mechanics of how that plays out. So how your client sees things, how they see themselves, will skew how they evaluate everything we just discussed, because they'll see all of this, or at least experience it through a different camera, a different lens, a different processor, which is kind of the point I just made. So give an example. Somebody is high systemic. They're like a computer. They think very cold and calculating. But why? Perhaps they enjoy the certainty. Maybe they appreciate massive amounts of certainty, or they feel like they're barely certain, so they have to think that way. They have to think like, some people will tell stories about how they'll go through like a crisis moment where somebody's attacking them, or they're in a car accident or something, and suddenly there's no emotion. They actually go cold. They go numb because they're going systemic, because that maybe gives them the certainty they needed to get through that moment, let's say. Or perhaps they want to avoid emotion. Maybe they're actually even more, maybe they have very high intensity pain and pleasure, and that's the only way they can get through the day, is by being like a computer. Step back and disassociate from the feeling and the emotion of it. Here's another example. Somebody is maybe low on the intrinsic internal. In other words, they have low, we used to call this self-esteem. I can't remember what the new version of it is, but it's your intrinsic factor on the internals, right? So it's like how clear you are on how your own feelings are. But you're low there, meaning that you have bias against it. Well, maybe you don't feel good about yourself right now, so you don't even want to think about that part of your life. Or perhaps you don't really care about your feelings so much. That's just it's not a big thing for you. Or perhaps you actually, maybe your client has lower self-esteem. And so their feelings about themselves aren't great. And so they try to disassociate from themselves. Perhaps they decided that they got to put their feelings aside. Maybe they have a tough job that hurts their feelings because they take shit from their boss. And so they set that aside. They have high self-esteem, but they have to kind of act like they have low self-esteem in that environment, maybe. And so it actually helps them to have a negative bias against their own sense of themselves. I think that's what we call it now, sense of self, right? Instead of self-esteem. So you might have a bias against your own sense of yourself, because why would you want to have sensitivity about yourself when you need to desensitize? It could be a combination of those things. It could be one of those things. It could be a whole slew of other things. You want to think, just like we talk about with values, what might be behind the biases that are going on in those attributes, because it ain't just one thing. There's usually 2 or 3 or more possibilities. Depending on the client, you might know, and it might predicate something else that you've already learned about them or that you need to learn. So I know that was a mouthful. And if this is sketchy for you, or you're like, what the hell is he talking about? That is okay. This will come together for you. Here's what it's going to take to do that, though, to have it come together. Because have you ever had one of those experiences where something was confusing, something didn't make sense, and it didn't make sense, and all of a sudden, bam, it all came together and made sense for you? You will have that experience with this very conversation. I can promise you that. But here's what it takes. What it takes is you got to watch this until it does make sense. Because, and I know you're right, Rosalie, I didn't have that many examples here. I had a few just to typify the concept. This is very much more conceptual. And so I wanted you to get the concept so you can apply it in how you think through, how you literally think through and filter what's going on in these graphs, and you start looking into this stuff. Now, what I am going to give you today before you go is some questions that you can use in your sessions when you see various attributes, various biases, various value sets, so you can actually get your own examples from your own clients, because you experience this stuff as a good detective. Even if you hunt for it, you'll be better. But if you start to hit the nail on the head with it by getting the right answers from your clients, or getting something that really connects the dots for you, so that the conceptual becomes tangible, it becomes experiential, which I know you need, then you'll never forget it. But what I want you to start with is not like knowing every story behind every single example of this, because we could go on for literally days to do that. We just don't have that kind of time. But what we can do is have you have a very solid concept of why things are the way they are, and enough to go ahead and explore that concept with your clients, which you literally have, that you could work with right now. So here's your assignment. Look at your graphs. Look at your clients' graphs. I say that every time. Look at their biases. What are the biases for how they want to see the world? This is literally in their attributes index. Is there a bias against a certain visual, or for a certain attribute or a certain dimension? Look at how they actually, like, the biases about how they want to see the world, how they want to filter the world. Then go to their motivators. Look at those motivators and ask, okay, what motivators are high? Obviously, which ones are low? And then ask yourself, why are these values this way? Why might they be this way? And then really, like, draw this picture for yourself. Think through it. And then, or you might want to watch this again as you're looking at your client's values and trying to connect those dots. And then these are the kind of questions I would be asking either myself with a client I'm very experienced with, or I'd ask my client in a live session. What do they believe that makes those values that way? Like, why? Hey, what do you believe that actually has it so you're you really highly value, like, perfection and aesthetics and beauty and that kind of stuff? Like, what's your philosophy about that? There's all sorts of different ways you can pose that question. And then also find out, when did you come up with that? Like, when did you start thinking that was important? Just yesterday because all of a sudden you ran out of money and now you decided economics are important? Or over the last couple of decades because you've run a business and you realize they are over that period of time, right? So find out when they realize that. That's going to tell you a lot about what predicated these values, and then what those pain and pleasure targets might have been that actually shifted those beliefs, shifted what the values ultimately were that they gleaned from that. And then ask yourself, how does all this work together? How are these biases around the attributes that govern how they see the world working with the biases, or not the biases, but working with the pain and pleasure targets that they have that precipitate up into various values hierarchies? How do those actually bounce off of each other? Do you value one thing and then you look at that very logically, or you value something else and you look at that very emotionally? Like, how would that change the story, change the way that particular client ticks? So that's what I'm going to ask you to explore. I promise you this. If you actually do that, especially with these concepts in your arsenal, you're going to come up with some interesting possibilities, if not answers. And those are the things to take to your clients. Hey, I've been thinking about this. I'm wondering if it might be this. And then get their feedback. They will, I mean, not every client is that sensitive to this stuff, but a lot of times when you hit the nail on the head, they'll be like, that's it. And the juice of that will get you once you start connecting some of those dots. Okay, so that said, every one of your team has the AI on them, but not your clients. Absolutely correct on that. But do this with your team members, because every one of them have their AI. And if they don't, we will make sure they have access to those. So thanks for bringing that up. All right, guys, any questions about this, let me know. My only request for you, which I always make at the end here, is share this with somebody who could really use this, somebody who might be hitting one of these sharp edges in their life, or maybe somebody who works with people like that, a coach, a mentor, a manager, who needs to see these dimensions because maybe they haven't at this point yet, or it might be just helpful to make a difference for somebody that they need to make a difference for as well. And even if you don't know anybody to share this with, if you hit a like button wherever you are, Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching this, usually the algorithm will push it out to the people who probably really need to see this, because there's somebody like yourself, even if you don't know them yet. So yeah, reach out to us about those, Barbara, because I will be happy to send you a sample and get you up to date on exactly what the attributes index is all about and what it measures. It's kind of a cognitive assessment that measures how somebody thinks, just kind of over the top of kind of the base motivations and instinctual responses that like DISC and motivators assessments tend to tell us. So that's your short explanation. But if you can share this with somebody who really needs it, or again, just make it shareable, really make a difference for them, I know. And then we're going to be kind of on the same mission together to enlighten people to some of this stuff, so that it makes a difference for them and their relationships, and their life, and their businesses. And I mean, this stuff is truly transformational, which is why I'm talking to you about it this late at night or early in the morning, whatever time it is for you. And I'd appreciate that if you do that. You'd be my partner in making a difference in the world. And that way it's free to whoever watches it for as long as we keep it out there. But again, like I said, if nobody else sees this, at least you make sure you go through this process for yourself and watch this a couple more times so you really get it ingrained, so it's like breathing for you. And you don't have to kind of push yourself to get the concept of it. Once you get the concept, it will start to play out in reality if you just run enough coaching sessions. Eventually, you're going to work your way through that. And only you can do that by actually running those sessions. You got it, guys. I will talk to you next time in, week 6 of Assessment Immersion Training. Take care.